can we get the spirit back in our country that allows us to build these great projects, the Hoover Dam, Tennessee Valley Authority, California High-Speed Rail? Is that possible, do you think? Are you hopeful for the future?
Look, anything is possible. You need leadership.
Francis Fukuyama is one of the most eminent political scientists in the world. His seminal book, The End of History and the Last Man, published in 1992, generated a wide-ranging academic debate. A faculty member at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, Professor Fukuyama has written on political theory, international relations, and has recently focused on the challenges of infrastructure for California and the nation. John Switalski, executive director of Rebuild SoCal Partnership, sat down with Fukuyama at the LA Times studios for a discussion about his ideas and interests.
Frank, thank you so much for joining us here. Rebuild SoCal Partnership is very proud to be able to sit down with you and have this conversation on the LA Times platform. So in your academic work, you've focused on political theory, obviously, state building and the defense of classical small L liberalism, rule of law, democracy, etc. But more recently, you focused on infrastructure. And I'm curious as to why that issue has become central to a lot of your thinking and writing.
Well, I think that infrastructure is a real problem in modern democracies. Infrastructure is ultimately a political issue because when you build, an electrical grid or a highway or an airport, it's creating what economists call a public good, meaning it's something that's generally good for the community. But it always hurts some particular interest. Somebody loses their right of way, somebody's business gets disrupted, and the like. And balancing that collective good against the individual harms is essentially a political problem. And my observation is that many democracies, especially in the United States and especially in California, have not been doing that well. And the result is that a lot of infrastructure is simply not getting built. We built Hoover Dam, Golden Gate Bridge, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Bay Bridge, all in the space of about 4 or 5 years in the early 1930s. And so there was a time in American history when we could really build big projects and do them quickly and well. And we seem to have lost that ability. And I think a lot of Americans are discontented that the government isn't producing the public goods that citizens expect.
We use the term infrastructure as a catch-all, and people's eyes just glaze over. But I try to think about this and try to communicate and educate to the public that this is everything you touch and feel. It's your library, it's your church, it's your recreation life. How do we talk about that as a society?
Right. Well, a problem with infrastructure is a lot of it is easy to take for granted. Like in the United States, in contrast to many developing countries, when you turn on your tap and fill your glass, you can drink the water that comes out of it. And there will be water coming out. And you're not going to have the electricity off for 4 hours in the afternoon because the grid can't provide it. And it's very easy to just forget about how, in a way miraculous it is that in the United States we don't have those kinds of problems. We were supposed to build high-speed rail in California. I think if we had completed that project in a reasonable amount of time and you could get to L.A. from San Francisco in 3 hours in a really beautiful train like the ones that exist in China, I think people would have been very impressed by that, and they would have understood that actually here's a project that actually makes our lives different. All of a sudden you don't actually have to live in San Francisco in order to work there. You can live, in an outlying area. So I think that, there's a certain kind of public infrastructure that I do think is very visible. And if we were able to build it, I think you would be able to make a political case that the government actually can do stuff.
Is there any example of good benefit in the present day? Anything that is potentially binding our communities, our body politic together?
In one of my earlier books, I use the term vetocracy, meaning that in our political system, we create a lot of veto points where people that don't like something that's going forward, they can stop it. And I think that in a democracy, you can't have a vetocracy. You have to actually do something, with a public purpose. And I think, one of the issues that we really have to deal with is to remove some of those veto points and, allow these bigger projects, these visible projects to go ahead.
The term abundance is thrown about now very often and casually, and that is paired with the term affordability because of the recent inflation and recent elections last year, and that's on the tip of everyone's, at least every Democrat's tongue in Sacramento. How do they go about this? How do they balance those two, and how do you remove vetoes from the system?
I think a lot of people would point right away to the California Environmental Quality Act. This is an act that empowers all 40 million residents of California to sue any project, public or private, that they want. They can sue it anonymously. There's no statute of limitations. And it turns out that only about 11% of CEQA lawsuits are actually launched by an environmental organization. Nobody's saying you don't want environmental regulation, but there are less costly and more efficient ways of getting, I think, to that same goal. And there's plenty of ways that you could simplify the CEQA process and achieve the same kind of environmental outcomes as the law intends.
A lot of the federal money in the Biden administration seemed to go into red states. The chip factories built in Arizona or being built in Arizona and Ohio, a lot of the IIJ money. Is there an obvious correlation there?
Well, I think Biden thought that he would get credit in these red states for actually creating employment and new infrastructure. But he ran into the problem that every administration has had. Obama had that same problem building, he wanted shovel-ready projects that could be immediately showcased as an achievement of his administration, and they just take too long. And so that then reduces the incentive of politicians to push these things. If they're not going to get credit for actually building stuff because the process is too cumbersome, then why bother, wasting all that political capital?
We represent over 90,000 unionized trades members who benefit from public infrastructure almost solely. Roads, bridges, water infrastructure. Is infrastructure investment a driver in leveling income disparity? And then secondly, is it kind of the foundation of a stable society, a stable democracy when you're investing money into the working and middle class and they're able to raise families and buy homes without a college education?
Well, you need to broaden the focus a little bit beyond public infrastructure. We have a housing crisis. This is blindingly obvious to anyone that lives in California. Housing affordability has become a major source of economic inequality because we simply do not build enough affordable housing in the state of California. So young families just have a tremendously hard time, saving enough money so that they can make the down payment on their first starter house. And that's the sense in which, this difficult permitting and, litigation process that puts all these obstacles in front of building affordable housing, kicks in, and it increases inequality.
If you think about New Deal politics, and we're going back a century ago, New Deal economics and the raising of the floor of wages and opportunities, big public infrastructure programs. Do you give any credit to that type of economic thinking, and does that economic investment pay dividends to society, to our democracy?
Well, it completely depends on, what you're investing in. I think that the logic behind high-speed rail was actually pretty good. It's something the Chinese, it's the way the Chinese think. It's not just the lowering of the time it takes to get from LA to San Francisco and the cost and so forth. It's also economic development because now you could live in Fresno, in Bakersfield, you could actually have an affordable house for your family, and you could work in one of those big cities. And that's going to then increase the population density in the Central Valley. It's kind of one of these build it and they will come sorts of things, right? That it's not directly meant to benefit Bakersfield, but it's certainly going to have a knock-on effect if it turns out that you can actually get in and out of, L.A. from Bakersfield very easily. And so definitely I think that, that is something that would have happened if we had been able to, to complete that project.
Are we in a crisis of infrastructure? And if so, is there an opportunity to turn that crisis into positive change?
I think that several things have to happen before you actually get action on this front. First of all, you need an idea. People have to see what the cause of the housing crisis is. They have to see it clearly, and they have to see that unless they actually build more stuff, you're really not going to bring housing prices down. You need to organize people behind that. So there is now this YIMBY movement, right, in California, where especially younger people are beginning to understand that they've got to organize, they've got to become a pressure group so that you can overcome the NIMBYism of all the older people that have, really valuable homes and don't want their nice view of the ocean obstructed, this sort of thing, that there's a real equity and fairness issue. And that's, the nature of democratic politics. You have to mobilize people, you have to argue, you have to inform. It's a slow process.
Do you think that there is movement because of the housing crisis, because of the affordability crisis, to make major changes in California on this front?
Well, I'm hoping that that's the case. There is a Build America caucus in the House of Representatives. So it's a bipartisan group of House members that basically accept the premise, of abundance and want to streamline, things like permitting, get rid of unnecessary veto points, make it easier to come to decisions. And that's a start. It's at least a recognition by the political class that this is an issue going forward. It's going to lead to a big fight within in a way it already has led to a big fight within the Democratic Party. I think in the end, I really do believe that somehow progressives in California, despite the fact that they are the advocates of greater equality, have created a system that actually makes the state much more unequal. And the same thing in terms of environment. It takes almost 10 years to permit a transmission line to get all that alternative energy out of Texas and Oklahoma and to the West Coast. And a lot of the people that are contributing to that failure to do that kind of permitting are actually environmentalists who I think have a much too short-term, view of what needs to be done. They're so used to simply putting up their hands and saying, no, stop, don't build it. And they don't accept the fact that actually you can't deal with either climate adaptation or mitigation unless you build a lot of stuff.
Let me flip the argument here and maybe even flip the discussion to a generation or two ago. This vetoocracy came about because there were past abuses where community concerns were not taken into account, where communities maybe had been bulldozed over unnecessarily.
Right, that's Robert Moses in New York City. Yeah.
Right, was probably the biggest, most famous person. So is there still some saliency in there that we do need to put some check on bureaucracy, on government, to make sure that they do have the individual communities' best interest at heart?
No, absolutely. I think that that's the essence of democracy, but it's a question of balance, because here you're really facing a trade-off between a collective interest in, reducing carbon emissions, building affordable housing, all of these sorts of general interests against, the particular interest. Again, this is why I think that infrastructure is such an interesting problem, because you can't build anything anywhere in the country without harming somebody's interests, right? And so the political task is to, reduce that harm as much as possible, compensate people that are suffering economic losses in the interest of a general, prosperity that will come from having more public infrastructure. And so it's a matter of balance.
I testify often in on behalf of infrastructure projects, and I make the case that there are trade-offs. You cannot escape trade-offs. This is a key to an elected a person's job, is working through what the good and bad trade-offs are and making the best decision you can. I think there's a rub there inside. You mentioned the Democratic Party, but just in society is how do we account for those trade-offs? How do we have a conversation that we need to build our way out and not just conserve our way into the future, and that those trade-offs, if calculated correctly, can benefit all of us in our children and grandchildren. Do you have any thoughts about how
Yeah.
elected officials should think through that?
Well, there are several things. So, and this is one of the actual research topics I've been looking at very intensively, which has to do with public participation. So in a modern democracy is not just voting every 2 years or 4 years for a representative who then makes a decision. We want more active citizenship where people can voice their concerns directly when there's a project, of common interest. The problem is that we do not have a good structure for public participation. These days, we're overwhelmed because some big rule changes produce 1 million comments, and somehow an agency is supposed to respond to every single one of them, and that makes a very cumbersome kind of process. Public meetings, I think, have a different kind of problem where you have certain very well-organized interest groups that always show up at the public meetings, and you kind of know what they're going to say in advance, but they're not interested in actually deliberating. And that's one of the things that I am personally working on, is how to streamline a participatory process that allows citizens to voice their concerns, but then doesn't lead to a 10-year process where you have just endless town hall meetings and it's like the proverbial committee that no one can ever make a decision out of. You can't have that kind of system. It has to be much more effective, representative, open, but ultimately decisive, because once you come to a decision, you're going to, go with it.
That's fascinating. Would you say a bit more about that? What would that process look like, or who would convene? Who would be the decision maker in that? Could you give us an example of how you would see that developing?
We have a deliberative democracy lab in my center, the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law at Stanford, run by Jim Fishkin, who has a method based on what he calls sortition, because you don't want to just open the meeting to all the existing interest groups that will then, have the same arguments over and over. And so they have a system of randomly selecting citizens. They sit them down in a room, like in a hotel room, for 3 days, and they give them a lot of information, common information, and then basically they're forced to actually talk to each other. And one of the interesting things about the experiments he's done along these lines is that they almost always come to an agreement, even on highly polarized, issues. If people aren't yelling at each other over social media, but they're actually sitting in a room talking to each other directly, they actually can come to, that kind of trade-off decision much more readily.
When we talk about bureaucrats, that often comes with a negative connotation, but that's not necessarily how you view it. Would you explain?
I think that there's a big misunderstanding in the United States about the nature of bureaucracy and what makes it so frustrating. There's a conservative narrative that says that unelected bureaucrats are out of control, that they are making decisions that affect other people separate from the elected representatives that have the legitimacy to make those decisions.
The deep state.
Yeah,
as
the
it were,
deep state. I think that is 180 degrees wrong. Bureaucrats are over-controlled. They are subject to so many rules, and in the end, they are motivated by complying with those rules rather than focusing on getting actual outcomes, good outcomes for citizens. So deregulation is important, but it's actually more important to deregulate the bureaucracy than it is even the private sector, because that's really what slows things down. That gets to this issue of state capacity. So state capacity is just about people. It's about having the right people with the right knowledge. So I think we need to actually take a lot of that capacity into the government. We need more young people that are tech savvy, that really understand the way that the private sector acquires technology, and we need to put them to work, for public purposes.
I can imagine it would be tough to sell a young person on going to work for a grinding bureaucracy where they can't see progress, they only see process.
Right. So you got to do two things at the same time. First of all, you've got to give bureaucrats more running room so that they can use their experience, judgment, common sense to make decisions and not have to look in a rule book, at every turn. And then you got to have competent people, because you're not going to trust, people that don't have the right background, experience, and so forth. And so both of those things, I think, have to be done simultaneously. And by the way, there's still a lot of idealistic young people out there. We've lost the sense that working for the government is actually a good thing to do, that if you want to help people, if you want to reduce inequality, if you want to open up opportunity, actually working for the government may be the way to do it. We had that sense back in the 1930s and 40s, when the administrative state was being first constructed. But I think people have lost that sense, really. Nobody wants to work for the government, and so the government continues to fail because you can't get good people working for it.
It's demonized
Yeah.
throughout the various levels of media. If we weren't in this terribly polarized environment, could you see reforming or setting the bureaucracy free as a bipartisan issue? Both sides would seem to gain in that type of a dynamic.
Well, I actually think that there may be a light at the end of the tunnel. This administration has been so, I think, reckless in trying to destroy the bureaucracy. First of all, people may begin to realize that actually you need these bureaucrats. You need the weather forecasters, the air traffic controllers, people that actually perform these functions that we, take for granted. And also, I think that executive power is being abused today with all the executive orders that the Trump administration is issuing. But I do think that the next president is going to have more running room to shape things. And you can either use that power for good or you can use it for evil. I think right now they're using it for pretty negative purposes. But in the future, you may get a president that actually knows what he's doing and, really wants to empower the bureaucracy to do positive things.
Hopefully in a different manner.
Well, beginning with just following the law, that would be a very nice thing if the president would actually comply with the law in these decisions that are being made.
I want to ask about your personal interest in building things, furniture and so on. Can you just talk about what interests you about that and kind of the bigger implications in your mind?
Well, as an academic and an intellectual, the stuff that I do in my day job is very abstract and ephemeral. I write things, I give talks, I teach, but I started building furniture many years ago. It all started when I was working in the State Department, because in the Secretary of State's suite on the 8th floor, they have this beautiful federal-style colonial-era furniture. So I began to teach myself how to build this stuff. At one point, a walnut tree fell in the backyard of my home in Virginia. So I cut it up with a chainsaw. I dried the wood for 2 years, and I turned it into a set of Pembroke tables. Very classic, colonial-era design. And when you can do something like that, it's very satisfying because you got a table, and you sit at it, you put your drink down on it. I mean, it's something you can feel and touch. And I also think that because of all the ideology that goes with computers and the information society, we've lost an appreciation for people that work with their hands. that can actually make material objects, that can, create a skill that is really hard to write down in a book because you really have to, it's depends on experiential learning. And that is also very satisfying when you can do something like that.
Your book, The End of History and The Last Man, was in one sense about patterns, and those patterns that can be seen in the long unfolding of history. So how do societies, how do communities break out of these patterns? Seems like we're in a pretty negative pattern as we speak.
No, we are. There's been a global decline in democracy. There's been a rise in authoritarian government. And the trends are quite negative. How do we break out? Well, in a democracy, I think you do it through democratic means, meaning that you win elections. You have to struggle, you have to mobilize, you have to convince people, you have to get people to vote. As long as you still have a reasonable democracy where you can hold an election, a reasonably free and fair election, that's how you reverse course. Now, it's harder dealing with an authoritarian country like Venezuela or Russia or China. China can build, high-speed rail very, very quickly, but it can also do things like zero COVID or implement, one-child policy in a very brutal fashion that really hurts a lot of people and in the end does not lead to good decision-making. And so I think that, in many cases, these authoritarian regimes look strong and look competent, but they actually are much more vulnerable. And so I think we need to also wait and understand that there's a longer-term struggle that's being played out.
Can we get the spirit back in our country that allows us to build these great projects, the Hoover Dam, Tennessee Valley Authority, the California High-Speed Rail? Is that possible, do you think? Are you hopeful for the future?
Look, anything is possible. You need leadership. You need the person that understands what the problem is, but also has the ability to speak to people. Right now, the way in which leaders speak to people is changing very rapidly because of technology, because of social media, and so forth. And so we need somebody that's up to date in terms of that ability, but also has the right ideas. And I think, in a way, I've sort of thought that this abundance idea is like a $20 bill sitting on the sidewalk, that somebody's going to notice it's there and pick it up, because I don't think that you can get out of this kind of populist rage simply by criticizing it. I think that you need to actually have a positive vision. This is a big problem the Democratic Party has right now, because most people just don't think the Democrats have any appealing vision for what they'd like the country to look like in 5 or 10 years.
You wrote a book about trust. Is that inherent, or is that something that you can teach or build? Is distrust just a part of our history and our cultural fabric? So how do we move forward distrusting our fellow citizens?
Well, it's both a permanent condition in certain respects, but it's also something that can be built, and it's something that can be squandered. So compared to other modern democracies, the United States has a political culture that distrusts government. I mean, that's just a fact of life. And part of what determines whether you trust the government is what you see it doing. So if it actually makes promises and keeps them, then you're going to trust it in the future. And if it fails at that, you're going to distrust it. Now, one of the big problems, I think, actually comes out of technology, because the internet and social media have grown up over the last, more than 10 years, where you've got this space where anyone can say anything they want. At first, we thought this was going to be great because this will help democracy. You don't need to go through a publisher, an editorial process in order to reach a very large audience. But it turns out people can say whatever they want, and they do. And a lot of that is very low-quality information. And it turns out that what's popular in social media is often, negative, hate-filled, lies travel faster in many cases than things that are true. And so we're dealing with this technology that in a way breeds distrust. And I think that, unfortunately, a number of political leaders have figured this out, and they've figured that they can advance their own careers by breeding more distrust. And so all the rhetoric, I think, about the deep state is, exactly that.
So, Frank, we're coming up on 1 year anniversary of the very devastating fires in Altadena, in the Pacific Palisades, and in Malibu. And those fires raise so many questions for us in the aftermath. How do we build back? Where do we build back? What was the capacity of the infrastructure? What should be the capacity of the water and road infrastructure? What is your sense of the type of lessons that we should take away from other instances that have happened around this country or even the world, and how do we build back in a more resilient way into the future?
Well, I think the fires, like any other natural emergency, show the importance actually of government, because really it's only government that can adequately respond to a threat of this sort. It's the only organization that has the resources, the organization, the manpower, woman power in order to deal with something like this. And I think it also reveals the flaws. I mean, one of the problems, I think, in the LA basin is that power is very decentralized. In this state, it's really remarkable how spread out power is. The authority of the mayor of LA is really very limited in many of the outlying areas. You have these statistics. California has 58 counties, about 4,500 independent agencies, and then all these different municipalities. And I think that you can understand why we've wanted to distribute power in a state as large as California and as diverse, but it creates a collective action problem. So when you need to coordinate over, many jurisdictions, there are a lot of people aren't used to that kind of cooperation. And so I think when you're building back, we need to pay some attention to the political institution rebuilding and whether we want, to be able to coordinate at higher levels, in this state.
Finally, you have a memoir, as I understand, being published next year. Please tell us all about it.
I've had some interesting experiences in my life, but also a kind of intellectual development, of the sort that I just mentioned, where I've changed my political views on quite a lot of issues. And there's also some bigger problems that I see for democracy, like this infrastructure issue that we've been talking about, where I've not written a book about it, and I just want to make sure that people understand, the way that relates to my thinking about, democracy more broadly, and, the crisis that we're in terms of both global democracy and American democracy. I am really grateful for this opportunity to talk about this subject, because it's one I've thought a lot about in recent years. I think it's really important, and I'm glad I've got a platform to, say things about it.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's our pleasure, and our listeners will be better off for it. So thank you so much.
Right. Thank you.